Unroll a chart across a table, not a printed one, a hand-inked sheet of vellum from the middle of the 17th century, the corners curling, the coastlines drawn from the memory of men who had actually sailed them. Start your finger at Amsterdam, in the tangle of canals and shipyards along the IJ. Follow the line south, past the English Channel, down the bulge of West Africa, past the Canaries and the Cape Verde Islands, where the trade winds pick you up and throw you across the Atlantic toward Brazil before curving you back east again. Then keep going, down past 30 degrees south, down to where the chart maker stopped drawing coastline and started drawing warnings. The bottom of Africa, the Cape. That corner of the map is where the most famous ghost story in maritime history was born. A ship that could never make port. A captain who swore he would round the Cape or sail until Judgment Day and got exactly what he asked for. Sailors called it the Flying Dutchman, and for 300 years it has been the shorthand for every doomed voyage, every vessel that vanished, every crew that never came home. But here is the part that gets skipped. The ghost story is the least interesting thing about it, because behind the legend sat real ships, real timber, real iron, real rope measured in miles. Ships built by an industry that was, at that exact moment in history, doing something no civilization had ever managed. The Dutch were mass-producing ocean-going vessels at a scale and a speed that would not be matched anywhere on Earth for another 200 years. And they were driving those ships into the single most violent stretch of water on the planet over and over on purpose. Because the money on the other side was worth it. The Flying Dutchman is not a story about a curse. It is a story about engineering pushed right up to the edge of what wood and hemp and human bodies could physically survive. And when you understand what those ships actually were, the ghost story starts to make a very different kind of sense. Let's start with the water, because the water is the antagonist in this entire story. Zoom in on the southern tip of Africa. The Portuguese navigator Bartolomeu Dias reached it in 1488 and named it the Cape of Storms. That name was accurate. It was also terrible marketing, so the Portuguese crown renamed it the Cape of Good Hope, and the new name stuck while the old one stayed true. What makes that stretch of ocean so lethal is not weather alone, it is a collision. The Agulhas current comes racing down the east coast of Africa out of the Indian Ocean, warm and fast, moving at speeds that can exceed 5 knots. That is faster than most 17th century merchant ships could sail in a decent breeze. Coming the other way, up from the Southern Ocean, is the cold Benguela current, pushing north along the Atlantic side. Where those two systems meet, the water does something that physics students still study. When a swell generated by a Southern Ocean gale runs north into the teeth of the Agulhas, the wave energy has nowhere to go but up. The wave shortens, it steepens, and it stacks. A swell that measured 8 meters in open water can double in height in a matter of minutes as it hits the current. Modern oceanographers have measured rogue waves off that coast exceeding 30 meters. Steel-hulled supertankers have been snapped in half there. That is the water Dutch captains were pushing wooden ships through 4 or 5 times a year, every year, for nearly 2 centuries. Now let's talk about the ships. Because to understand the East Indiaman that sailed the Cape, you first have to understand the vessel that made the Dutch rich enough to build them. In the town of Hoorn, sometime around 1595, a shipwright whose name has mostly been lost designed a hull that changed European commerce. The vessel was called a fluit, and by any measure that matters, it was one of the most quietly brilliant machines of the pre-industrial world. The fluit was ugly. Everyone agreed on that. It was fat and rounded below the waterline, tapering sharply above into a deck so narrow it looked like the ship had been squeezed in a vise. English sailors mocked it. Spanish captains thought it looked like a floating barrel with masts. But the shape was not an accident, and it was not aesthetic. It was arithmetic. Every major port in Northern Europe charged tolls, and several of them, including the critically important Danish Sound tolls at Elsinore, calculated the fee based partly on deck area. So the Dutch built ships with enormous cargo volume below and almost no deck above. They paid the toll of a small vessel while hauling the cargo of a large one. It was tax engineering rendered in oak. The performance numbers are what really land. A typical fluid ran about 80 feet on the keel and carried between 200 and 300 tons of cargo. It did that with a crew of 12 to 15 men. An English merchant vessel of equivalent capacity in the same period needed a crew of 30 or more. Half the labor cost, moving the same goods on the same routes. That is not a marginal advantage. That is the kind of advantage that reorganizes an entire continent's economy, and it did. By the middle of the 17th century, the Dutch controlled somewhere between half and three-quarters of all European carrying trade. How did 15 men handle a ship that size? Mechanical advantage. Dutch riggers pioneered a system of blocks and tackles that multiplied human force to a degree their competitors simply had not bothered with. Halyards ran through double and triple blocks. Sheets were led to positions where two... Before we go any further, I need to stop for a second, because what I've been showing you in these videos only scratches the surface. And I realized at some point that the full picture, the actual pirate code, word for word, the real punishment records, the exact treasure division shares, the ports that secretly funded them, it doesn't fit in a video. I put it all into one document, the Black Flag Codex. It's linked below, and the QR code is on your screen. Now, let's keep going. 2 men could apply the force of 5. The sail plan itself was simplified, square canvas on the fore and main, a lateen on the mizzen, nothing that required a specialist to handle. And the construction was industrialized to a degree that sounds anachronistic. The Zaan district north of Amsterdam had, by the 1650s, several hundred wind-powered industrial mills, sawmills that could cut planking in a fraction of the time a pit saw team needed, mills for processing hemp into cordage. Dutch yards pre-cut standardized hull components and assembled them. A fluid could be launched in 3 to 4 months. A comparable custom-built vessel in an English or Iberian yard took a year or more. So the Dutch had the best merchant ship in the world, and it was completely inadequate for what came next. In 1602, the Dutch government forced a group of competing trading companies to merge into a single entity, the Verenigde Oost-Indische Compagnie, the VOC. It is routinely described as the first multinational corporation, and that undersells it. The VOC had the legal authority to raise armies, wage war, sign treaties, mint coinage, imprison and execute people, and found colonies in the name of the Dutch Republic. It was a corporation with a foreign policy. At its height, the VOC employed roughly 50,000 people, operated over 150 merchant vessels and 40 warships, and paid dividends, averaging around 18% annually for the better part of 2 centuries. But to do any of it, the company needed ships that could survive the run from Amsterdam to Batavia on the island of Java, roughly 15,000 nautical miles each way. 8 months out if the weather cooperated, 18 months to 2 years for a full round trip. The fluid could not do it. The hull was too lightly framed for the sustained battering of Southern Ocean swells. The narrow deck left nowhere to mount a serious battery of guns, and the route was crawling with Portuguese, Spanish, English, and eventually French vessels who would happily take a fat, unarmed Dutch merchantman as a prize. And the rigging, optimized for the short chop of the North Sea, would strip itself apart in 40 knots of sustained westerly. So VOC engineers took what the fluid had taught them, the efficiency, the standardization, the crew ratios, and built something new around it. The retur ship, the East Indiaman. The transformation was dramatic. A large VOC Indiaman ran 150 to 160 feet in length, with a beam around 40 feet and a displacement between 600 and 1,200 tons, nearly double the length of a fluid and several times the mass. It carried between 24 and 40 guns. It carried a crew of 200 to 350 men, most of whom were not sailors at all, but soldiers, artisans, and company employees being shipped east. And the hull was built like nothing else afloat. Start at the bottom. The keel of an Indiaman was oak, often assembled from 2 or 3 massive timbers, scarfed together with long overlapping joints and locked with iron bolts driven through and clenched over on the inside. That keel had to be strong enough to absorb the entire ship's weight, slamming down into a wave trough. In a heavy Cape sea, a ship pitching off the back of a swell could drop its bow 20 feet and land on solid water. The shock load runs through the stem, into the keel, and out through the frames. If the keel scarf failed, the ship broke its back and the crew had perhaps 10 minutes. Above the keel came the frames. On a coastal fluid, frames sat 18 to 20 inches apart. On an East Indiaman built for the Cape run, they sat 12 to 14 inches apart, and in the areas of highest stress, they were doubled, sitting nearly shoulder to shoulder with almost no gap between them. The lower hull of a VOC Indiaman was in places closer to a solid wall of oak than a frame and plank structure. Here is the detail that I find genuinely extraordinary. Each of those frames was made from naturally curved timber, not steam bent, not cut across the grain from a straight log, because cutting across the grain creates weak points where the fibers run out of the piece. Instead, Dutch timber agents traveled through the forests of Westphalia, the Rhineland, Denmark, and the Baltic looking for individual trees whose trunks and major limbs had grown at the specific angle needed for a specific position in a specific hull. Think about the logistics of that. A shipwright in Amsterdam draws a hull. That drawing specifies dozens of different curves. Agents then go into forests hundreds of miles away and physically find trees that happen to have grown into those shapes, mark them, fell them, drag them to a river, float them downstream, ship them across the Baltic, and deliver them to a yard where they are seasoned for 2 to 3 years before anyone touches them with a tool. The seasoning mattered enormously. Green oak shrinks and twists as it dries. A hull built from unseasoned timber would open its seams within a year, and an opened seam in the Southern Ocean is a death sentence. The planking went on using carvel construction, edge to edge, rather than overlapping, producing a smooth exterior. The seams were caulked with oakum, which is tarred hemp fiber picked apart from old rope, driven into the gaps with an iron and a mallet by specialists who did nothing else. A large Indiaman had several miles of seam to caulk. Then the seams were paid with hot pitch to seal them. Then came the problem that no amount of good carpentry could solve: Teredo navalis, the shipworm. It is not a worm at all, but a bivalve mollusk with a tiny shell at one end that it uses like a drill bit. It bores into submerged wood, lines the tunnel behind it with calcium carbonate, and eats its way through the timber, growing as it goes. In warm tropical water, a mature shipworm colony can turn a solid oak plank into something with the structural integrity of a sponge in under a year. Dutch ships spent months in warm water, every voyage. The shipworm was not an occasional problem, it was a guaranteed one. The first countermeasure was sacrificial planking. Over the structural oak, shipwrights nailed a thin outer layer of cheap softwood, usually pine or fir, with a coating of tar and animal hair sandwiched between the layers. The worms ate the pine. When the ship was careened for maintenance, the ruined sacrificial layer was stripped and replaced, and the oak beneath was untouched. The second countermeasure was lead. By the later 17th century, some Dutch vessels carried thin sheets of lead nailed over the underwater hull. It worked against the worm, but it created a problem nobody at the time understood. Lead in contact with iron fastenings in salt water sets up a galvanic cell and the iron corrodes away. Ships lost rudder pintles and fastenings for reasons that seemed inexplicable to their builders. There was a third enemy, less dramatic but nearly as costly: fouling, weed, barnacles, and marine growth accumulating on the hull. A badly fouled bottom could reduce a ship's speed by 30 to 40%. On the Cape run, 30% slower meant missing your weather window, and missing your weather window meant attempting the passage in conditions that killed ships. So VOC vessels were careened at every opportunity. The ship was run into shallow water at high tide, guns and cargo shifted to one side, tackles rigged to shore anchors, and the entire vessel heeled over until one side of the bottom was exposed. Crews scraped, burned off growth with torches, replaced damaged sheathing, and repaid the seams. Then they righted her and did the other side. It took days, and during those days the ship was defenseless, immobile, and structurally stressed in ways it was never designed for. More than one vessel was lost during careening. Now go up. Stop for a second. What you just heard about the pirate code is the part that rewrites everything you thought you knew. But it only lands when you see the actual shares, the exact fractions written into the Articles of Agreement, the punishments, the port records, the names of the men who funded them from government offices. It's all in the Black Flag Codex, linked in the description. 5 seconds. Grab it now, because what comes next builds directly on it. Link is below. QR code is on your screen. Because if the hull was the foundation, the rig was where the real violence happened. A fully rigged East Indiaman carried 3 masts and a bowsprit. The main mast could stand 100 feet or more above the waterline, and it was not a single stick. Trees tall and straight enough for a mainmast of that size were rare and getting rarer, and Baltic supply was periodically cut off by war. So Dutch mast makers built made masts, assembling several timbers around a central spindle, binding them with iron hoops and then with woolding, which is heavy rope wrapped in tight turns around the assembly and hammered down hard. A made mast, done properly, was stronger than a single tree mast of the same diameter. The joints between the components staggered the grain, so a failure in one timber did not propagate through the whole structure. Above the lower mast came the topmast, and above that, the top gallant mast, each one fitted so it could be sent down in heavy weather. That was not a convenience feature, it was survival. Every foot of mast above the deck is leverage acting on the hull. In a Cape gale, a ship with top-gallant masts still aloft was carrying enormous windage where it did the most damage, and the rolling moment could put the rails under. Sending down the upper masts in a rising gale, in the dark, in spray, on a pitching deck, was one of the most dangerous jobs at sea, and it was routine. Now do the physics. Wind force on a sail scales with the square of wind speed. A sail that experiences a certain load at 25 knots experiences 4 times that at 50. In a Southern Ocean gale, the load on a single close-reef topsail could exceed 10 tons. That 10 tons has to go somewhere. It runs from the canvas into the yard, from the yard into the mast, down the mast into the mast steps socketed into the keelson, and from there out through the frames into the hull. Simultaneously, it is resisted by the standing rigging, the shrouds and stays that hold the mast up, which transmit their load through the channels on the ship's side, through the chain plates, and into the hull planking. Every one of those load paths was a potential failure point, and the failure of any one of them meant a dismasting. A dismasted ship in the Roaring Forties was, in practical terms, already dead. Without the rig, she cannot steer, cannot hold her head to the sea, and falls off into the trough, where she rolls beam on to breaking waves until she is overwhelmed. Crews carried spare spars lashed on deck, spare blocks, spare canvas, and hundreds of fathoms of spare cordage, precisely because everyone understood how close to that edge they were operating. The rope alone tells you the scale of the enterprise. A large Indiaman carried somewhere between 20 and 30 miles of hemp cordage. The VOC's rope walk in Amsterdam was over 1,000 feet long, one of the largest industrial buildings in Europe. And here is the thing about hemp. It stretches when wet and shrinks when it dries. Standing rigging had to be set up with deadeyes that allowed constant adjustment, and part of a crew's routine work in changing weather was retuning the entire rig. Set the shrouds too loose, and the mast works in its step. Set them too tight, and a shrinking wet line can pull the channel off the ship's side. So now put it all together and take it around the Cape. The standard VOC route by the mid-17th century was worked out by a navigator named Hendrik Brouwer in 1611, and it was counterintuitive enough that the company initially had to order captains to use it. Instead of hugging the African coast and creeping east through the light and fickle winds of the Indian Ocean, Brouwer proposed running south from the Cape into the belt of westerlies between 40 and 50 degrees south, sailing east on those winds for around 4,000 nautical miles, then turning north for Java. The Brouwer route cut the voyage from Amsterdam to Batavia from roughly 12 months to under 6. It also took ships directly into the Roaring Forties, and the Roaring Forties are unlike anything else on the ocean. At that latitude, there is almost no land to interrupt the westerly flow. The wind blows around the entire planet unobstructed. which means the wave fetch, the distance over which wind can build a sea, is effectively infinite. Swells build and build with nothing to break them, and the resulting waves are long, high, and relentless. A ship running east before those seas takes them on the quarter, which produces a combined corkscrewing roll and pitch that puts the hull through a cycle of stress with every wave. The bow lifts on a crest while the stern sits in a trough and the whole vessel bends. That is called hogging. Then the reverse, with the middle supported and the ends unsupported, which is sagging. Hog, sag, thousands of times a day, for weeks. Wooden ships work. That is the sailor's term for it, and it is literal. The hull flexes, seams open slightly and close again. Water is driven in and pumped out. On a long passage, the pumps ran constantly, in watches, day and night, and the sound of the pumps was the background noise of the entire voyage. VOC shipwrights fought hogging with internal structure. Riders were massive transverse timbers bolted across the inside of the frames at the points of highest bending stress. Stringers ran fore and aft along the inside of the hull, tying every frame to its neighbors and distributing bending loads over a longer span. Knees, the L-shaped brackets connecting the deck beams to the frames, were cut from naturally grown crooks or forged from iron. The combination produced a semi-rigid internal cage inside the hull that let the ship flex without tearing itself apart. That is the engineering. Now, here is where it becomes a ghost story. Because there was one captain who took all of this and pushed it further than anyone thought possible, and his name is one of the two most often attached to the Flying Dutchman legend. Bernard Fokke was a real man, a VOC captain sailing in the middle of the 17th century, and by every surviving account, an extraordinary one. His reputation rested on a single fact: he made the run from the Netherlands to Java in roughly 3 months and 4 days. The normal passage was 6 to 9 months. Fokke was doing it in half the time, repeatedly, in the same class of vessel every other captain was sailing. That kind of performance gap does not go unnoticed, and in a superstitious age, it does not go unexplained either. The explanation the waterfront settled on was simple. Fokke had made a deal with the devil. His masts, people said, were sheathed in iron because ordinary wood could not stand the sail he carried. He was seen as something not entirely human, and when he eventually failed to return from a voyage, which he did, the story wrote itself. But strip the sulfur off it, and look at what Fokke was probably actually doing. He was almost certainly running the Brouwer route harder and deeper south than his contemporaries dared. Where a cautious captain might dip to 40 degrees south and edge back north, at the first serious blow, a captain willing to accept the risk could hold his latitude and stay in the strongest part of the westerly flow for weeks. The difference in daily runs is enormous. A ship in the heart of the 40s, carrying sail, could log 250 nautical miles in a day. The same ship in the variables further north might make 80. Do that for 6 weeks and you have gained months. The cost is that you are asking your rig to carry sail in conditions where prudent seamanship says reef down and run. You are asking your hull to take quartering seas at speed. You are asking your crew, who are cold, soaked, and probably scurvy-ridden, to go aloft in a gale to hand and reset canvas over and over. And you are betting your ship on the assumption that none of the 10,000 components in your load path chooses that particular moment to fail. Fokke made that bet over and over and won, until the day he didn't. The iron-sheathed masts detail is the part I find most interesting, because it is exactly the kind of rumor that starts from something real. We know Dutch mast makers used iron hoops on made masts. A captain who drove his ship harder than anyone else would reasonably have specified additional iron banding on his lower masts. To a sailor on the dock who had never seen a mast reinforced that heavily, that looks like a man preparing his ship for something unnatural. Now, the sightings. Between the 18th and the 20th centuries, there are dozens of recorded encounters with a phantom ship off the Cape, and not all of them come from drunk foremast hands. The most famous was logged on the 11th of July, 1881, aboard HMS Bacchante. The midshipman who recorded it was Prince George, the future King George V. The log describes a strange red light, and within it, the masts, spars, and sails of a brig standing out in relief about 200 yards distant. 13 men aboard confirmed the sighting. The lookout who first reported her fell from the foretopmast crosstrees the following morning and was killed. So what were they seeing? The overwhelmingly likely answer is an optical phenomenon called Fata Morgana, a superior mirage caused by a temperature inversion, where a layer of cold air sits beneath warmer air. Light traveling through that boundary bends downward, following the curvature of the Earth, and carries images of objects that are physically below the horizon into view. The waters off the Cape are one of the best places on Earth to generate this effect, precisely because of the current collision we started with. Cold Benguela water against warm Agulhas air produces exactly the kind of sharp thermal boundary that bends light. And the visual signature matches the legend almost point for point. Objects appear stretched vertically, so a distant ship looks impossibly tall, with masts that seem to rise out of proportion. The image shimmers and shifts as the air layers move, so the vessel appears to change shape. It can appear to hover above the water with a visible gap beneath the hull. And critically, as an observer sails toward the mirage, the optical geometry changes and the image retreats or dissolves. A ship that cannot be reached no matter how you steer. That is the single most consistent element in every Flying Dutchman account, and it is a textbook description of what a superior mirage does. The unnatural glow fits too. When the mirage carries light from a vessel that is in sunshine while the observer sits under overcast, the image appears self-illuminated, and the scattering along a very long shallow light path shifts the color toward the red end of the spectrum. So the ghost ship was almost certainly a real ship, just 30 or 40 miles away, over the horizon, lifted into view and distorted by the atmosphere into something that looked like it did not belong to this world. But explaining the sighting does not explain the legend, and I think the legend deserves better than being written off as an optical illusion. Because the reason sailors believed it was not that they were credulous, it was that the story described something they knew to be true. Between 1602 and its dissolution in 1799, the VOC dispatched roughly 4,700 voyages from the Netherlands to Asia. It lost somewhere in the range of 150 to 200 ships. Some of those wrecks are famous. The Batavia, driven onto Morning Reef off Western Australia in 1629, where the aftermath produced one of the most horrifying mutiny and massacre episodes in maritime history. The Zuidtorp, which vanished in 1712 and whose wreck was not identified until the 20th century, and many more that simply left port and were never heard from again. No wreckage, no survivors, no explanation, just a name in a ledger, a family in Amsterdam waiting for a man who was never coming back, and a company writing off the cargo. The human cost dwarfed the material one. Of the roughly 1 million Europeans the VOC shipped east over 2 centuries, something like a third never returned. Scurvy was the great killer. Nobody understood the mechanism, but the Dutch understood the correlation well enough to found a settlement at the Cape in 1652 specifically to grow fresh produce for passing fleets. Cape Town exists because Dutch ships were arriving in Java with crews too sick to unload their own cargo. It was, in the most literal sense, an engineering solution to a biochemical problem built by people who had no idea what the problem actually was. So put yourself on that deck. It is 1680. You are 11 weeks out of Table Bay. The ship has been running east under close reef topsails for 9 days without a break. You are permanently wet. Your gums bleed when you chew. 2 of your messmates went over the side last week, and there was no possibility of turning back for them. The pumps have not stopped since Tuesday. Below you, the hull is groaning through its hog and sag cycle, and every man aboard knows the sound a working ship makes and knows what it means when the sound changes. And your captain will not shorten sail. In that state, at that latitude, if something appears on the horizon at dusk that looks like a ship but behaves like nothing you have ever seen, you are not going to reach for atmospheric optics. You are going to reach for the story everyone on the waterfront already knows. The captain who swore he would round the Cape if it took him until the end of the world. The ship that never made port. Because that story is not really about a ghost. It is about the possibility that you might be on that ship, that your captain might be that captain, that the whole enterprise you are part of, all this brilliant timber and rope and iron, all this accumulated skill might not be enough. And here is what makes it fit so precisely. The Dutch built the most advanced ships in the world. They industrialized timber, standardized construction, engineered rigging, mapped currents, established supply chains, invented marine insurance and joint stock risk pooling to absorb the losses. They did everything right. By the standards of what was knowable at the time, they were the best in the world at this, by a wide margin. And the ocean still took one ship in 25. That is what the Flying Dutchman actually is. Not a curse, a residue. The accumulated memory of every Dutch hull that flexed one time too many. Every made mast that let go in a squall. Every seam that opened at 3 in the morning 800 miles from land. Every captain who looked at a falling barometer and decided he could carry the sail for another 6 hours. The VOC itself went down eventually, and not to the sea. It was bankrupted in 1799 by corruption, by war with Britain, by the same appetite for risk that had built it. But the technology outlived the company. The hull forms, the framing systems, the rigging arrangements, the navigational practices worked out on the Brouwer route, all of it became the foundation of European naval architecture for the next 2 centuries. And the Cape is still there. The Agulhas still run southwest at 5 knots. The swells still come up out of the Southern Ocean and stack against the current. Container ships built of steel and driven by engines still occasionally lose containers, or superstructure, or themselves in that stretch of water. And on certain evenings, when the cold water sits under warm air and the light comes in at the right angle, something still appears on the horizon out there. Tall masts. A narrow silhouette against a red sky, moving, apparently, but never getting closer. It is not a ghost. It is light bending around a ship that is genuinely there, just too far away to reach. But if you had spent 11 weeks in the 40s in a wooden ship with bleeding gums and a hull that would not stop working beneath your feet, you might call it something else. You might call it the Flying Dutchman. And you might believe, with whatever you had left, that some ships were built for a passage the world was never going to let them finish.